Okay, thank you. I'm going to talk about distributions and aggregates in heterogeneous agent old Keynesian models and new Keynesian models. So here goes. Um, so I'm going to basically function as an intermediary. I'm going to tell you some thoughts of Keynes and Samuelson about macroeconomics. I'm going to tell you some different thoughts of Kenneth Arrow. I'm going to talk about resuscitate an old debate between Burns and Mitchell on the one side and Koopmans, Marshak, Hurwitz, and a whole string on the others. I'm going to talk about some what I'm going to call Indiana macroeconometrics and functional vector autoregressions, which are the natural econometric tools for heterogeneous agent models. And then I'm going to talk about heterogeneous agent new Keynesian subversives. Okay, so I'll begin with Keynes's macroeconomics. So recall the senses in which Keynes intended his general theory of employment, interest, and money to be general. Three senses. First, it explains equilibria with excess supplies or unemployed resources. Just a question. I'm hearing an echo. Are you okay on your side? Can everybody hear me okay? I'll just keep going. The second sense is it collapses to the classical or Walrasian theory when resources are fully employed. And the third sense is it justifies minimal, and I'll describe the sense of minimal, fiscal monetary interventions to attain full employment. So what were Keynes's minimal policies? They had basically two or three parts. One was he wanted to sustain a price level target. He wanted a zero inflation tax. I'll tell you where I'm getting this from. He wanted two government budgets, a current account budget and a capital account budget. He wanted the current account budget always to be balanced, period by period. He wanted the capital account budget balanced to the present value sense, but he wanted to time deficits and surpluses to finance public works to attenuate the business cycle. He was thereby enforcing an American proposal by two people, Ketchings and Fosters, in the 1920s to use public work to support full employment. Keynes' stipulation behind all of it. This is old Keynesian heterogeneous. He assumed his light-handed macro policies presumed that there was an adequate United Kingdom's 1920s style social safety net in place. So what was the heterogeneous agent old Keynesian punchline? It was what was called the neoclassical synthesis. The idea was that you achieve full employment by using well-timed public investment to sustain adequate aggregate demand. And then once full employment prevails, you allow the Walrasian system of markets to set relative prices and allocations. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to now just give you some beautiful quotes from Keynes. The neoclassical synthesis. I'm getting these quotes mostly from the general theory of 36 or his tract on monetary reform of 23 or 24. So read this. He says, the complaint against the system, present system, is not that those 9 million men who are employed to be put to tasks, but he wants additional tasks for the remaining 1 million men who are unemployed. So it's determining the volume, not the direction of actual employment that the existing system is broken down. So who embraced the neoclassical synthesis? Well, a whole bunch of really smart people. Paul Samuelson, James Tobin, Milton Friedman, Robert Lucas, and a whole string of others. In terms of macro theory, in terms of econometrics, Koopman's, Hurwitz, Coles Commission econometric modeling tradition was aimed at building Keynesian econometric models. So then, later I'm going to talk about subverting the neoclassical synthesis. And some smart people have been interested in doing that. But just remember who they're arguing with. Kenneth Arrow, I'll come to that. Violante, Nuno, Golosov, and a whole bunch of people, many smart people on the program at this conference. So let me describe, before talking about subversion of the neoclassical synthesis, let me tell you how Keynes got to it. So how did Keynes get to the neoclassical synthesis? So what I recommend that you do is, so Keynes was thinking about these things for a long time. Read a tract on monetary reform, the first chapter. And what Keynes is preoccupied with, in the whole book, but throughout, especially chapter 1, he sets the stage. He's concerned with the connections between inflations and deflations, and the distribution of wealth and consumption among, and these are his words, investors, those are portfolio holders, the business class, those are people that borrow to create capital, and earners, wage earners. So he's concerned with distribution on the one hand and production on the other. So here's a digression. A modern counterpart of these things that Keynes is concerned with is Menabone, Floden, Bandari, Evans, and so on. Imputation of the welfare consequences of alternative government policies in Hank models that flow from redistribution. And that's intimately connected to Keynes's distribution of wealth and consumption versus production. Okay, so here's where Keynes goes. He gives a powerful case for price level targeting, and he was serious about this through the end of his life. And he talks about and he is writing at a time when those who believe in market economies are under great stress from things going on in the Soviet Union and Italy, and then ultimately 10 years later in Germany. Various versions of communism or National Socialism. And he says those who are not in favor of drastic changes in the existing organization of society, and Keynes was a conservative in that sense, he believed that these arrangements, markets, are in accord with human nature and they have great advantages. But he says they cannot work properly if money, which they assume is a stable measuring rod, is undependable. Unemployment, the precarious life of the worker, the disappointment of expectation, the sudden loss of savings, the speculator, the profiteer, all proceed in large measure from the instability of the standard of value. Now, he's a price level targeter. And then he deplores redistribution via unforeseen inflation. This is going to be a thing we'll come back to. He says there's no record of a prolonged war or a great social upheaval which has not been accompanied by a change in the legal tender, but an almost unbroken chronicle in every country which has a history, it's a broad statement, back to the earliest dawn of economic record, of a progressive deterioration in the real value of successive legal tenders which have represented money. And he doesn't like that. So he says, moreover, this progressive deterioration in the value of money through history is not an accident. And he has to have behind it two driving forces that he wants to arrest. The impecuniosity of governments, the inflation tax, and the superior influence of the debtor class. And then he also says, he notes that the benefits of depreciating currency are not restricted to the government. All sorts of debtors who are liable to pay fixed money dues share in the advantage. So so here, I want to ask, just as a digression, that's a little fun, is about Keynes's quality as an historian and as a forecaster. So I'm going to peek at some U.S. price level and public debt ex-ante return data that were assembled by George Hall. I'll show you the 20th century. Most of these data happened after Keynes made those statements, and then the 19th century, and they're going to raise a question. So here's the log of the price level in the U.S. Starting at 0 after the start of two world wars, World War II and World War I. And look at World War II. You see the log of the price level heads north. Keynes is a pretty good predictor. World War I is more interesting. It heads north for a while, comes down in 1920. This is 20-year span. This graph has been rigged to match the start days of the war. So 0 is either 1941 for the U.S. or 1914. And if you look at World War I, notice prices stabilize in the 20s. Then they drop very fast during the Great Depression, and they come back. That's going to have a role. Real returns on government debt for the first 10 or so years, and beyond that, 20 years, cumulative real returns of people who held U.S. government debt were bad, just like Keynes said. World War I is an interesting story. Notice that they recover in the Great Depression. Something Franklin Roosevelt didn't like. So if you extend this digression on U.S. debt default beyond 1933, it sets the stage for Sebastian Edwards' book about American default. A subtext for that is Irving Fisher's debt deflation theory and using monetary policy to redistribute and repair balance sheets influenced the Roosevelt administration's decision to default. So both Fisher and Keynes, who are price level stabilizers, are instrumental. Their ideas are instrumental in convincing Roosevelt to do what he did. So read Sebastian Edwards' book to see about how distribution effects were front and center on these Keynesian policies. Well, so Keynes's forecaster, who was pretty good for the 20th century, and actually, if you see what's happened in the U.S. during the war on COVID, Keynes looks pretty good then too. But what about the U.S. in the 19th century? What about Keynes as a historian? Well, in the 19th century, I'm going to show you again. These are counterpart graphs. The Civil War and the War of 1812. Big inflation. There's a log of the price level from the beginning of the war. Big inflations during the war, and then after the war, deflations that actually, did what Keynes said you should do. In the Civil War, the U.S. brought the price level after 20 years back down to almost to where it started. In the War of 1812, it did even better. And so what happened is it gave high cumulative returns to people who held U.S. legal tender currency. So that raises a question. What's going on? Why was the 19th century pattern so different from the 20th century pattern? Well, who chose what when? That's all about this. And so why am I talking about this in a talk on heterogeneous agent macro? Because heterogeneous agent macro is as old as the hills. And there was if you wanted to look at the political economy, you drill down, there were advocates of partial default. And after the Civil War, there was a big controversy that was about what Keynes was talking about. So the president of the United States in 1868, he wants to default by he wants to tax and pay lenders not back in gold but in a depreciated currency. And he says this is scary. The lessons of the past admonish the lender that it is not too well to be over anxious in exacting from the borrower rigid compliance to the letter of the bond. That's what he says. And the Democratic Party embraced that in its platform. What did the Republican Party say? It said the Republican Party, you could read their whole platform. he says, we denounce all forms of repudiation as a national crime, and national honor requires the payment of the public indebtedness in the utmost good faith to all creditors at home and abroad, not only according to the letter, but in the spirit of the laws in which it was contracted. And that prevailed, and that explains why those post-Civil War returns looked very different than the post-World War I and World War II returns. This is just scratching the surface on why these distributional, the balance of interests changed between the 19th and 20th century. Okay, so Keynes's policy priorities. So look what he says. He says, we must make it a prime object of deliberate state policy that the standard of value in terms of which they are expressed should be kept stable, adjusting in other ways the redistribution of the national wealth if in the course of time the laws of inheritance and the rate of accumulation have drained too great a proportion of the income of the active classes into spending and control of the inactive. So that's the case for Keynes's neoclassical synthesis. Light-handed touch, separate redistribution policy from aggregate demand policy. So now we're going to, in the theme of this conference, we're going to I'm going to give a take on questioning the neoclassical synthesis. By the way, I can if you say you didn't think Friedman embraced the neoclassical synthesis, well, read his presidential address when he defines the natural rate of unemployment, and he talks about it as something ground out by the Walrasian system of equations. That's his language, which created a big debate between. Anyway, I could tell you more about that if you ask me. Okay, so here we go to Arrow. I'm gonna quote from something I highly recommend: Kenneth Arrow's review of Paul Samuelson's collected works, 1967. Samuelson has not addressed himself to one of the major scandals of current price theory, the relationship between microeconomics and macroeconomics. Neoclassical macroeconomic equilibrium with fully flexible prices that's the Walrasian system, presents a beautiful picture of the mutual articulations of a complex structure, full employment being one of its elements. What is the relationship between this world and either the real world with its recurrent tendencies to unemployment and labor, and indeed of capital goods, or the Keynesian world of an unemployment under an unemployment equilibrium? Well, Samuelson had given an answer. He bought Keynes. He says, if the neoclassical model with full price flexibility were sufficiently unrealistic that stable unemployment equilibrium be possible, then in all likelihood, the bulk of the theorems that Samuelson himself, Arrow, and everyone else from the neoclassical assumptions are also counterfactual. They're wrong. The problem is not resolved by what Samuelson has called the neoclassical synthesis, in which it is held that the achievement of full employment requires Keynesian intervention, but that neoclassical theory is valid when full employment is reached. It's a direct challenge. And now he gets nerdy. So read this. He writes down two models: a K of G. G is a bunch of policies. K is the Keynesian model, and he writes W of G, Walrasian, and he says, if G star is such that full employment holds in K of G bar, can it be true that theorems and valid in W of G bar are also valid in K of G bar? He says no, and that's the heart of what a bunch of new Keynesians are up to. So that's a direct challenge. And then my job is to not tell you what I think. Go read Arrow's whole paper. It's beautiful. Another thing he says, Samuelson, Arrow notes this, Samuelson was really unsympathetic to the econometric branch, the Koopmans, Hurwitz branch using econometrics to fit Keynesian models. He was very unsympathetic. Arrow was sympathetic to that, and he noted that the major developments in macro theory, the developments of more subtle theories of the consumption function and the distributed type theories of investment, have been closely associated with econometric investigation. He's talking about Friedman, Modigliani and Ando, Jorgensen's theories of investment, which were active at that time. Look at the date, 1967. Okay, so this observation of Arrow, it's the bridge. He recommends taking econometric findings theory seriously. So now let's kind of fast forward. Let's go back to the basics, and then we'll jump to econometrics that I think, at least, are pertinent for new Keynesian macro models. So I'm just going to go back to a formalism that's both very old and very contemporary in terms of these days of machine learning and big data. So what's a statistical model? It's a probability distribution f of y given theta of a random vector that could be a sequence indexed by parameters theta. That's what statisticians and macroeconomists mean by a statistical model. Well, there's two types of statistical models, both of which are useful, but they're very different. There's a descriptive model where there's a set of parameters theta descript, where the parameters are data reducers like regression coefficients, shock covariances. They're not fully interpreted in terms, or maybe interpreted at all, in terms of objects intelligible to an economic theorist. They're data descriptors, and that's all they are. What's a structural model? Well, theta if you have a structural model, the parameters are fully interpreted. Nowadays, post-rational expectations econometrics, they're interpreted as pinning down preferences, technologies, endowments, information structures, surprises that instigate Keynes's great phrase, mistakes of foresight. Okay, so what are the purposes of statistical models? Well, different purposes. Descriptive models are dimension reduction, data compression, pattern recognition. Noble purposes. What about structural model? They're designed to uncover invariants that, and this is a language from physics, but it got imported to economics by Koopmans and Marshak, and then Lucas adopted it. Uncover invariants that can support theoretical analysis of unprecedented policy interventions. The word unprecedented is going to be important. Things that you never observed in the sample, but you might want to try. Okay, so let's put this to work and do a little history. So Koopmans versus Burns and Mitchell, really an important debate. And Koopmans' Measurement Without Theory, I recommend reading that carefully. It's a model of constructive criticism, constructive, sympathetic, and devastating criticism. He said that Burns and Mitchell's measuring business cycles, which provided the procedures that are used today by the National Bureau of Economic Research to date business cycles, they had constructed a descriptive statistical model. And Koopmans made a bunch of suggestions for sympathetic suggestions how to improve that, basically using dynamic versions of factor models that various people picked up with profit. So what Koopmans said is, if you really want a structural model, you want to use this to do policy, and he wanted to use it to do policy because he was on the group of people devising a statistical methods that could be used to estimate Keynesian macro models. So in his book, which I recommend, his editor, Koopmans' Statistical Inference and Dynamic Economic Models, a wonderful book. He wanted to construct structural Keynesian econometric models so that they could recommend aggregate demand management policies that would implement the neoclassical synthesis. So see, for example, Koopman's 46 paper in the AER. So what are the connections between the two types of statistical models? They're intimately connected. So what did Koopman want? Koopman wanted. He wanted theta descriptive to be a function somehow. So you have a descriptive model. You come to me and you have these thetas, which are data reducers. He wanted to get a function where those were a function of some other parameters in a structural model. So he wanted to construct this F. And actually, it might ring a bell. This is the link between structural and reduced form models in Koopman's language. So why did he want that? Well, maybe he could try to recover theta structural by applying F inverse to an astructural model. That's the key thing. Now that may ring a bell because that's the key idea of indirect inference, which is a really powerful tool. So just to remind you what that structure is, it came out of the 90s. Tony Smith's thesis is one of the first, but there's others precedents. There's an auxiliary model. So you're a structural Hank guy, and you have let's say, or a HAOK guy, and you have a structural model, and you want to estimate it, but it's too hard to do maximum likelihood. So you write down an auxiliary model. It's a descriptive model that is a likelihood function that describes the data well, and you can compute the likelihood function and maximize it easily. So what you do is that's step one with a descriptive model, and then you estimate the structural model by using scores. Take the log likelihood function, take the derivative, construct the force of an auxiliary model to generate the appropriate GMM criterion. And Gallon and Tauken describe beautifully how that's a really good procedure, a remarkably good procedure. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about, here's the way I'm going to go. I'm going to talk about what's a class of descriptive models that a heterogeneous agent new Keynesian economists might be interested in. Well, it's what's called a functional autoregression or a functional stochastic process. So what a heterogeneous agent that person wants to do is a huge state space. He has a density, like a cross-section density of some stuff, some wealth, some consumption, or something else. And a density is an infinite dimensional object. So let's call the log density L. And what's a functional autoregression? You just run an infinite dimensional VAR. So that first line there is LT plus 1 of X. X is the density. You just run that first order VAR where you can write it as LT plus 1 equals BLT plus UT plus 1. Looks like a VAR. You just have to remember that L is of dimension infinity by 1 and B is infinity by infinity. So how on earth could you estimate that? Well, okay, and if this rings a bell, it's people are doing related things when they're computing equilibria of heterogeneous agent models. We're going to approximate LT of X, that density, by taking a finite dimensional basis, psi 1s through psi k, and some coefficients on the basis. We're going to fix the basis, and the basis functions psi I of X. Those don't involve T. They're either sieves or functional principal components. There's infinite dimensional principal components you can do. So that's what you can do. And then what's the whole idea? You run a VAR, a finite dimensional VAR, on the basis coefficients, and then you use the basis functions to back out approximations of the density. That's the idea of functional functional autoregressions. Okay, so this leads to something. So there's people doing this. I'm going to call it Indiana Macro. There's a group at Indiana. There's other people. They fit functional VRRs to cross-section densities of interest to macroeconomists. So there's Chang, Hu, and Park, and they've pushed this in clever ways. They've described how to incorporate co-integration, and you could extend that to do additive functionals, a la Lars Hansen's Econometrica 2012 paper. There's another paper out of Indiana. There's a thesis out of Indiana. And then there's a Yale Penn branch of this, which I'm going to mention. There's a paper by Chang, Chen, and Shorfighty, and they do VARs for aggregates and cross-sections of consumption density, which they beautifully estimate as a hidden Markov model. And they are not so much the Indiana group yet, but the Yale Penn paper, they're definitely motivated by contact with the Hank models. So I'm going to talk about that. But before I do that, I'll just stay nerdy, geeky for a while. There's another promising line, and I think this is it's gonna come. There's a 90-year-old paper by someone who wrote papers with John von Neumann. He's a very important figure, Bernard O. Koopman. This paper, and he described, he invented something they're now called Koopman operators, and it's a trick for mapping lower order nonlinear systems into higher order linear systems. And the whole idea is shrewdly choose your measurements of states. You choose measurements of the states. They turn out to be eigenfunctions of a certain operator. And these Koopman operators are used now. They've incited a literature in fluid dynamics about how to estimate nonlinear dynamics. And the key thing is a singular value. It's basically running regressions on tall and skinny data matrices X. So this is using machine learning techniques on data. There are promising links between this and functional autoregressions. And how do I know that? It's a hunch. It's because the same objects are in play. They're different attacks on the same objects. Anyway, so what's the findings from this econometric stuff? This paper, Heterogeneity and Aggregate Fluctuations by Chang, Chen, and Shorfighty. It's hot off the press. What do? They fit a descriptive. It's purely descriptive. In this language that I said, they fit a descriptive functional VAR, and they fit it beautifully as a hidden Markov process. They acknowledge that their observations on the cross section are noisy observations on the density. They do the inference beautifully, and then they have a very informative discussion of a mapping that I talked about that Koopmans wanted, a theta structural as the inverse of this. They study a mapping from the descriptive. There's descriptive parameters to the structural parameters that a Hank person would estimate, and they do that using some simulation methods. So that's a really interesting part of their paper and how they make contact. And then they have sophisticated interpretations. I'm going to give you kind of my own interpretation. So what they do is they talk about with this functional VAR. They stack a functional VAR with an ordinary VAR for the aggregates, and they talk about cross relationships between movements in the cross-section densities of consumption, say, as example, or wealth, and how that interacts with the aggregates. They could go both ways. They study kind of the Granger causality between the distributions and the aggregates. That's kind of what they're onto. And I advocate reading their paper. They can be interpreted as describing how well they have a subtle description of what their results mean. I regard them as as describing how well off equilibrium, unprecedented feedbacks from cross-section dynamics to aggregates have actually been made to disappear through the prevailing social safety net and aggregate demand policies that have been in place in, let's say, the post-war U.S. That's kind of a mouthful, but so there's feedbacks that can't be detected because they've been offset. If that reminds you of something, think about how the right way, in my opinion, the right way to read Lucas's Cost of Business Cycle, either his 87 or his 2003 paper. It's that the costs have already been ameliorated by policies that Volcker and Greenspan and others put in place. So the Shorefati et al. Penn stuff goes beyond that. So there's more Indiana macro on the way. I'll just say that. I just got a paper yesterday. So the way to say this, and I'll come back to this remark about Shorefati, and also my earlier remark about Keynes's caveat that his recommendations were assuming that there was a safety net in place that was operating well. This new book by Graham, Eklund, and Early, it just came out this summer or this fall, is about American inequality. And if you look at this graph, this is graph. They look at how some of the transfers and taxes in the U.S. have gone a long way toward equalizing the after-tax transfer income of the lowest, of the first, second, and even the third quintiles in the United States. It's a striking graph. So look at the black line and that green line is those taxes net of transfers. And I think they've actually neglected, because they don't have the numbers, some transfers that are in place. So there's a lot of transfers already going on. I just saw a new paper by an NYU graduate student who talks about how consumption fluctuates over the cycle much less for low income workers than for higher income workers. That's related to this. So I'm just going to with this welfare is really being important. Keynes's caveat. So how do we think about welfare? And I'm going to loop back to something. So kind of the state of the art, in my opinion, talk about work on optimal welfare provision, both theoretical and applied, is to apply recursive mechanism design. That is dynamic programming squared, which represents history dependence via continuation values of states. So distributions matter, and history dependence matters, as it does in incomplete markets models, and also models in models of optimally managing incentive problems. So, like in my opinion, a gold standard papers is Pavoni and Violante's optimal welfare to work programs. They put this machinery to work in a micro context, and I think they're designing things to improve this graph. And then there's a follow-up paper by Pavoni, Setti, and Violante, and they talk about how the principal, the government, can use a combination of welfare benefits to minimize the costs, the social costs of smoothing. So that's in place. Okay, so now I'm going to return how these Violante style tools have been used by some people to subvert the neoclassical synthesis. So there's this paper by Bondari, Evans, and others. This isn't the only one. What they do is they apply Violante style dynamic programming squared to ex ante heterogeneous Hank models. So there's different types who have different risks. They're exposed to different business cycle risks that are that are calibrated to capture some of not short-fighties, but other people's governance and other people's evidence. And then what they do is they compute Ramsey plans, the best under commitment. And they compare outcomes and policies under optimal history-dependent policies with those recommended by an ordinary Taylor rule. An ordinary Taylor rule. Taylor's rule of two. It's very simple. And then they interpret the differences in terms of motivations of the Ramsey planner. And I want to compare those motivations to what Keynes said that the macro person should be doing. And what they find is that responses of optimal, in this paper, of optimal policies to aggregate shocks differ qualitatively and quantitatively from what they would be in a corresponding representative agent economy. And they're much larger. And the Taylor rule can be much improved on. And there's a motive to provide insurance that arises from the heterogeneity in incomplete markets. And it completely outweighs the price stabilization motives. There is a price targeting motive embedded in these models, but it's swamped by these heterogeneous agent considerations. So in this paper, using one of these, an updated version of the Benabou-Floden welfare decomposition, the sources of the welfare gains, they're quite different from what Keynes was advocating. The insurance component is positive and greater than 100%. The redistribution component is small. That's in line with Keynes's neoclassical thesis. But the aggregate efficiency component is negative, which is the opposite of Keynes's instincts. His instincts were use aggregate demand to take care of aggregate efficiency, get yourself to the full employment frontier. Let the social safety net from other sources act. And then, so you'll see that this is different. Okay, so I'm just quoting from this paper. Essentially, all the welfare gains from optimal Hank policies arise from the additional insurance that they provide. Provision of insurance comes at the cost of sacrificing price stability, which creates losses and lowers aggregate resources available for consumption. Well, that's subversive of the neoclassical synthesis. Maybe Arrow would like that, but I don't think Samuelson and Keynes would. Okay, so I'm ready to conclude. So these are my half-baked thoughts about Hank versus heterogeneous agent old Keynesian models. I'll just say that I think they're enduring and important issues. And I look forward to hearing what economists younger than I, and almost every economist is younger than I, have to say. And I'm ready to, I'm done. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Professor Sargent, for this wonderful lecture. So I think we have time for questions. If anyone wants to share.
Do you want me to stop sharing my screen?
We're seeing you. Paulo Garcia.
Hi, Professor Sargent. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. Regarding your mention of the importance of price level stabilization, would it be correct then to assume that you believe that inflation targeting, which is purely forward-looking, where the price level is somewhat indeterminate, is dangerous or not an efficient way of conducting monetary policy?
So, so here's my answer to that. So it's not what I believe doesn't matter. I was playing my role of being an intermediary, and it's really it's clear. I was representing as well as I could from my rereading of Keynes what he wanted, and he was a price level targeter, not an inflation target. It's very clear from reading that, and he acted on it. If you look at what he did at Bretton Woods, he and the reason and many things he did, he wanted to target. The reason he wanted to leave the gold standard is he thought he could create something that was more stable. Same with Irving Fisher. So they were not 2% people, no question about it. And Milton Friedman, when he wrote down what he thought the optimal problem, he was actually not a 2% either person. He wanted a deflation effectively. So so what I think doesn't matter. I'm talking about the history of thought and how and my role is to put on the table about how what happened in this in a number of models that are new Keynesian models. They have sources of price stickiness that look a lot like they're just imported from the standard new Keynesian model, which had some kind of Calvo stickiness or something like that. Imported that directly, but when you add this heterogeneity and you compute optimal what the central banks should do, they're quite different. And if you kind of think these are just if-then statements. If you kind of ask, well, how does that affect the dual mandate? When you solve a Ramsey plan or something like that, you don't start with the dual mandate. You start with a welfare criterion, and what you should do pops out. Okay, so what pops out of this is it's something that's not light-handed. Okay, and that has consequences, and it's kind of interesting. So this contrast between these two types of Keynesian models, the old and the new, the high oak, I don't know how you pronounce it. That's something that's been with us for a long time. Actually, in some sense, the heterogeneous agent model predates the new neoclassical synthesis model. People were talking about redistribution before they were talking about stabilizing the macroeconomy. At least in my own country, 19th century, 18th century macro policy wasn't about assuring full employment. It was about reallocating between creditors and debtors of all types. And it wasn't until anyway. So I'm not answering your question, but because I don't know.
Thank you. James.
Yeah, this is Jim Bullard. Hi, Tom. Thanks for the nice lecture. In the Bandari-Evans paper, I'm not sure who the other co-authors were. The Ramsey planner, when you do Ramsey problems, you have to say something about what the planner can do and what the planner cannot do. And it seems like in actual economies, we have sprawling governments that have many policy dimensions, and if you try to compact them down just to the central bank's interest rate policy, you might get a different answer than if you had a more fully specified range of alternatives for the entire public policy approach to macroeconomics.
Yep. So it's really worth looking at that, and it bears on. Remember, it bears on what I said was Keynes's caveat. It's like in the background. I'll just have some fun with it. In the background, somebody has solved and implemented the Violante-Pavoni optimal redistribution. That's in the background. And so it's off the plate for the central bank. That's kind of the thrust of yours. And what you properly point out, Jim, is, and it's really important to look at in these in these papers like that Bandari Evans et al. Paper. Lots of these structural Ramsey problems is you ex cathedra say that lots of things can't be done. And the only things that can be done are what the model builder gives to the Ramsey planner, and actually he or she, the Ramsey planner, uses the things that he can do to offset the things that can't be done. So this provision of insurance, the monetary authority providing insurance by monkeying around with inflation and interest rates and redistributing between bondholders. That's why what Jim spotted is that's why I went back to the 19th century and had that debate between Andrew Johnson and Ulysses S. Grant, which was a debate about how to redistribute. It's a lower frequency, and the Bandari Evans thing is we're going to do that high frequency. But it's a good point. And it actually, what's amazing, Jim said, is like it's amazing that all the discussion of central banks. There's some people who thought that the central bank actually can't stabilize inflation, or it can't stabilize the price level, even do that on its own, unless it gets a lot of help from the fiscal authority. Go across the border to Argentina and get a few observations. So now various places say, well, not only should you do that, you should also do all sorts of things that the Congress and the president can't do anything about global warming, but maybe the central bank can. Anyway, sorry to go on for that, but that's where Jim's question. Thinking about Jim's question gets one started.
Hi, Professor. Thank you very much for your very inspiring keynote. So I'm the director of the Monetary Policy Division at the Central Bank. We're currently designing our 5-year ahead working plan, and it's quite important to figure out correctly which are the areas on which we should be investing, especially in terms of the modeling challenges going forward. So my question is related to that, and I guess it's a follow-up on Paulo Garcia's question, or at least it's a follow-up on your answer to his question, I guess, which is there are two implications, the way I see that, two main implications of adding heterogeneity into models, or motivations, if you want. The first motivation is that once we add heterogeneity, either significant heterogeneity or heterogeneity in the right places, we're going to get significantly quantitatively different results from the ones that we used to get from just representative agent models. And they might be significantly different in terms of implications to macro shocks, or maybe monetary policy responses to these shocks, and so on. So that's one motivation. Adding heterogeneity changes the quantities. Now, the other motivation is that maybe it doesn't change the quantities so much. Maybe the aggregate effects are sort of similar, but that these redistributional aspects are important enough that maybe the quantitative variables that we look at are not good proxies of aggregate welfare. So I get a hint from your talk and your answers that you're sort of pushing this second one. So I would like to know if in your synthesis of the modern, heterogeneous agent discussion so far, which would you say is the predominant force? Of course, they're not mutually exclusive, but which would you say holds more promises? Is this about getting the quantities right, or maybe rethinking about which are the aggregates we should be actually targeting? Thank you.
So I'm going to be, okay, sincerely, so you know what, so because you asked that question, so lots of times, what identifies a smart scientist or economist is framing the right questions. So you did that. And so I don't the way to make you don't want to hear me thinking about that. You want to hear the people that you invited to the conference, who they're the future. Look, I know I looked at the program. I know so I'm a consumer. So and my little caveat about how to interpret Shorfides, a superficial reading of the Penn Yale paper would be, well, that's kind of it's kind of negative on heterogeneous agent macro. I don't think that's the way to read it. And I think it interacts with Bullard's question. It interacts with Bullard's question. Because to interpret that right, you got to figure out, and the beautiful thing about an astructural model, it's silent on actually with the source of the distributions that we see. And then, and I also mentioned that Graham thing. That Graham thing is, there's measurement issues about that. So, yeah. Anyway, so once again, I failed to answer a well-framed question.
Thank you very much again, Professor Sargent, for your presentation. Provide us with key insight for this conference. Let's give him another round of applause. Thank you again.
Thank you.
We're ready now to move to the next session.